Everyone knows Jackie Robinson broke baseball's color barrier. Almost nobody knows he later helped build one of the most ambitious black-owned banks in American history. For years, it financed Harlem's businesses, backed homeownership, and grew into an institution with assets of roughly $120 million. Then it collapsed, putting the savings of an entire community at risk. So how did a bank built on hope become one of Harlem's greatest financial tragedies? This is the story history almost forgot. Chapter 1. The bank Harlem built for survival. By the middle of the 20th century, Harlem had become one of the most influential black communities in America. It was a center of culture, politics, and entrepreneurship, home to generations of families, artists, professionals, and business owners who had built something extraordinary despite decades of discrimination. But behind Harlem's success was a problem that threatened its future. The community created wealth, but it did not always control where that wealth went. For many African Americans, traditional banks were not reliable partners. Getting a mortgage, securing a business loan, or accessing capital for expansion could be far more difficult than it was for white Americans with similar financial situations. The result was a painful contradiction. Black communities were working, saving, and building businesses, but many lacked the financial institutions needed to turn those achievements into lasting generational wealth. By the 1960s, civil rights leaders understood that political equality alone could not solve every problem. The ability to vote and access public spaces mattered, but economic power was just as important. Without control over capital, communities remained dependent on institutions that did not always prioritize their needs. This was the environment that led to the creation of Freedom National Bank of New York. The idea behind the bank was simple but ambitious. Create a financial institution that would serve people who had often been ignored by the mainstream banking system. It would provide loans to entrepreneurs, support homeownership, and keep more financial resources circulating within Harlem and other black communities. The bank opened its doors in 1964, at a historic moment in America. That same year, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law, marking a major victory against racial discrimination. But while legal barriers were beginning to fall, economic inequality remained deeply rooted. A new law could guarantee rights, but it could not immediately create opportunities. Families still needed mortgages. Businesses still needed loans. Communities still needed institutions they could trust. Freedom National Bank was created to fill that gap. However, building a bank required more than an idea. It required money, leadership, and most importantly, credibility. People had to believe that their savings would be safe and that the institution had the strength to survive. That was where Jackie Robinson entered the story. By this point, Robinson was already an American icon. In 1947, he became the first African-American player in Major League Baseball's modern era when he joined the Brooklyn Dodgers and broke one of the most visible barriers in American sports. But after baseball, Robinson continued fighting for equality in another arena: economic opportunity. He believed that true progress required more than opening doors in sports and politics. Black Americans also needed access to the financial systems that helped communities build lasting wealth. His involvement with Freedom National Bank gave the institution something incredibly valuable: national attention and public trust. Jackie Robinson's name carried a level of respect few people in America possessed. For many Harlem residents, his connection to the bank represented more than celebrity involvement. It represented confidence that this institution was part of a larger movement for Black empowerment. But the bank was never built by one person alone. Behind Robinson were bankers, investors, and community leaders who believed Harlem needed greater control over its own economic future. They wanted a place where a small business owner could seek financing without facing the same barriers that had existed for generations. For a time, that vision began to work. Freedom National Bank grew into one of the most recognized Black-owned financial institutions in the country. It became a symbol of what was possible when a community created its own economic infrastructure. But the biggest challenge was still ahead. Because creating a bank was one thing, keeping it alive in a changing financial world would prove to be the battle that determined whether Harlem's dream would become a lasting legacy or a forgotten chapter in history. Chapter 2. Jackie Robinson's Final Fight for Black Wealth. When most people think about Jackie Robinson, they remember the moment he stepped onto the field at Ebbets Field in 1947 and changed baseball forever. They remember the pressure, the insults, and the courage it took to break a barrier that had existed for generations. But after baseball, Robinson entered another fight. This time, the battlefield was not a stadium, it was the American economy. Robinson believed that breaking racial barriers meant little if Black families were still locked out of the systems that created long-term wealth. A person could gain opportunities in education, sports, and employment, but without access to capital, the ability to build something lasting remained limited. That belief shaped his work after retirement. He became involved in business ventures, supported civil rights organizations, and pushed for greater economic independence in Black communities. Freedom National Bank represented one of the biggest examples of that mission. The bank was not created simply to compete with existing financial institutions. It was created because many people believed existing institutions had failed an entire community, and Harlem responded. When Freedom National Bank opened, it represented something much larger than a place to deposit money. It was a statement that Black communities could create and control institutions designed around their own needs. The bank focused on areas that directly affected everyday life. One of its most important roles was providing access to credit. For decades, many Black entrepreneurs had struggled to secure loans from traditional banks, making it difficult to open new businesses, purchase equipment, or expand existing companies. Freedom National Bank aimed to change that. A small business owner who had previously been rejected elsewhere could now approach an institution that understood the challenges facing the community. A family hoping to purchase a home had another option beyond banks that had historically limited opportunities for Black buyers. This was the power of community banking. The money deposited into the bank could be used to support the same neighborhoods where those deposits originated. Instead of savings leaving the community and being invested elsewhere, the bank could help recycle those resources back into Harlem. And Jackie Robinson understood exactly why that mattered. He knew that sports heroes could inspire people, but institutions could transform communities. A baseball player could open a door for future generations, but a bank could help families walk through that door, buy homes, start companies, and create wealth that lasted beyond one lifetime. During the late 1960s and 1970s, Freedom National Bank continued building its reputation. It became part of a larger movement of Black-owned banks across America that emerged from the struggle for civil rights. These institutions were not just businesses, they were symbols of independence. At a time when many Black communities were demanding more control over their political and economic future, Black-owned banks provided a practical way to turn those demands into reality. But running a bank was a difficult challenge. Unlike larger financial institutions that had existed for decades and had access to enormous amounts of capital, smaller community banks often operated with fewer resources. They had to compete in a financial industry where technology, regulations, and customer expectations were constantly changing. Freedom National Bank was trying to achieve something ambitious: serve a community that needed it while also competing against much larger institutions. And for several years, it succeeded. The bank expanded its presence, attracted new customers, and became one of the most important Black financial institutions in America. Its connection to Jackie Robinson gave it national recognition, but its real strength came from the trust it built within the community. People were not just opening accounts, they were investing in an idea. They believed that a bank created for Harlem could help Harlem become stronger. But behind the success, new challenges were beginning to appear. The same financial world that made a Black-owned bank necessary was also changing rapidly. Larger banks were becoming more aggressive, economic conditions were shifting, and maintaining growth would become increasingly difficult. Freedom National Bank had proven that a Black-owned financial institution could rise. The next question was whether it could become powerful enough to survive. Because at its peak, this was no longer just a neighborhood bank, it was becoming one of the largest symbols of Black economic ambition in America. And soon, the numbers would reveal just how far Jackie Robinson's financial dream had grown. Chapter 3: The $120 million Black Banking Empire. By the time Freedom National Bank reached its strongest years, it had become far more than the small community institution many people imagined when it first opened. It had become a symbol. For Harlem, the bank represented something that had been missing for generations. A financial institution created with the community, not just for the community. The bank's growth reflected a larger movement happening across America. During the decades after the Civil Rights Movement, many Black-owned businesses and financial institutions worked to prove that economic independence was possible. They were built around one central idea. Communities that controlled their own financial resources had a better chance of controlling their own future. Freedom National Bank became one of the most visible examples of that vision. Its customers included individuals, families, and businesses that needed access to financial services often denied or limited elsewhere. The bank provided loans, supported entrepreneurs, and helped residents pursue opportunities that could strengthen their financial position. For many customers, the importance of the bank was not only measured by its balance sheet, it was measured by the opportunities it created. A business owner who received financing could hire employees. A family that secured a mortgage could build home equity. A young entrepreneur who gained access to capital could create a company that supported the next generation. This was the cycle that Black-owned banks hoped to create. Money deposited into the institution could become loans that supported the same communities where those deposits originated. Instead of wealth constantly flowing away, it could be reinvested locally. And Freedom National Bank grew during a period when that mission was urgently needed. However, growth in banking is measured differently from most businesses. A restaurant can succeed because customers love its food. A clothing company can grow because people buy its products. A bank grows because people trust it with their money. That trust became one of Freedom National Bank's greatest assets. The connection to Jackie Robinson played an important role in building that confidence. His reputation gave the bank national visibility, but the institution's survival depended on something much bigger. Thousands of customers believing that their money was safe and that the bank was helping build something meaningful. At its height, Freedom National Bank became one of the largest Black-owned banks in America, with assets reaching roughly $120 million. That number represented decades of effort from community leaders, bankers, investors, and customers who believed Black communities needed financial institutions of their own. But the importance of Freedom National Bank cannot be understood only through the amount of money it controls. The bank existed during a period when Harlem and other Black communities were undergoing major economic changes. Many neighborhood businesses were struggling with rising costs, changing demographics, and competition from larger corporations. Access to credit became even more important because small businesses needed financial support to adapt. A community bank could provide something larger institutions often could not: an understanding of the people it served. The bankers knew the neighborhood. They understood the challenges local entrepreneurs faced. They understood that a loan was not simply a financial transaction. It could determine whether a family business survived or disappeared. This was why Freedom National Bank became such an important symbol. It showed that economic empowerment was not just an idea discussed by activists. It could exist in real form, inside a building where people deposited money, applied for loans, and planned their futures. But every financial institution eventually faces the same test. Growth creates opportunity, but it also creates pressure. As Freedom National Bank expanded, the banking industry around it was changing. Larger financial institutions were becoming more competitive. Regulations were becoming more demanding. Economic conditions in urban communities were becoming more complicated. The bank had succeeded in proving that Black-owned banking could work. Now it had to prove it could survive. And that would become the hardest challenge of all. Because the same institution that once represented Harlem's financial independence would soon face a series of problems that threatened everything it had built. The rise had been remarkable, but the fall would reveal the challenges that even a historic bank backed by a legendary figure could not escape. Chapter 4: The Collapse of Harlem's Financial Dream. For a bank built on the promise of independence. The most painful part of Freedom National Bank's story was that its biggest challenges did not come from a lack of ambition. They came from the reality of running a financial institution in a rapidly changing world. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the environment around community banks had changed dramatically. The banking industry was becoming more competitive, larger institutions were expanding aggressively, and smaller banks were facing increasing pressure to keep up with new technology, regulations, and customer expectations. Freedom National Bank was no longer operating in the same world it had entered in 1964. When it opened, the bank represented a solution to a major problem. Black communities needed financial institutions willing to serve them when many traditional banks would not. But over time, the financial landscape began shifting. As discrimination laws changed and larger banks became more willing to compete for Black customers, Freedom National Bank faced a challenge that many minority-owned banks experienced. The very barriers that had made these institutions necessary were slowly changing. However, that progress created a new problem. Freedom National Bank now had to compete against much larger institutions with deeper resources, larger customer networks, and greater financial flexibility. A community bank could provide trust and personal relationships, but competing in modern banking required something more. It required capital, it required efficiency, and it required the ability to manage risk in an increasingly complicated financial environment. Those pressures became even more difficult as Harlem itself experienced major economic challenges. Like many urban communities across America, Harlem faced problems including declining investment, business closures, and economic instability. The neighborhood that had once represented one of the strongest centers of Black culture and in entrepreneurship was dealing with a difficult transition. For a bank deeply connected to that community, these struggles created serious challenges. A bank's strength depends heavily on the financial health of its customers. When businesses struggle, loans become harder to repay. When families face economic pressure, savings and borrowing patterns change. And gradually, the institution that had once represented opportunity began fighting simply to remain stable. The situation became increasingly difficult as the years passed. Freedom National Bank continued trying to serve its mission, but maintaining a Black-owned bank in an era dominated by large national financial corporations was becoming harder. The bank's story reflected a larger issue affecting many minority-owned financial institutions across America. These banks were often created because communities lacked access to mainstream financial systems. But once those systems began changing, these smaller institutions had to compete against companies that had decades more capital and infrastructure behind them. The challenge was not just attracting customers, it was surviving in a financial industry where size increasingly determined strength. Eventually, Freedom National Bank's financial problems became impossible to overcome. Regulators became involved, and the bank's condition continued to deteriorate. In 1990, federal regulators closed Freedom National Bank after determining that the institution was no longer able to continue operating safely. The closure marked the end of one of Harlem's most important financial experiments. For customers, it was a devastating moment. For decades, people had trusted the bank not only with their money, but with their hopes. It represented the belief that Harlem could create institutions powerful enough to control its own economic future. Now, that symbol is gone. But the collapse of Freedom National Bank did not mean the idea behind it had failed. Its story revealed something much deeper about economic progress. Building a successful institution requires more than a powerful mission. It requires constant adaptation, strong financial management, and the resources to survive changing conditions. Jackie Robinson and the founders of Freedom National Bank had proven that Black communities could build financial institutions capable of reaching remarkable heights. But the fall of the bank showed how difficult it was to protect those achievements. The doors eventually closed. The name faded from everyday conversations. But the question remained. How could a bank that once represented Harlem's economic future become one of its greatest financial losses? And why does its story still matter decades later? Chapter 5. What Jackie Robinson's bank left behind. When Freedom National Bank closed its doors, Harlem lost more than a financial institution. It lost a symbol. For nearly 3 decades, the bank represented a powerful idea, that a community could create its own economic future. It stood as proof that Black Americans could build institutions capable of managing millions of dollars, supporting businesses, and providing opportunities that had been denied for generations. But its story was never only about money. It was about control. For much of American history, wealth was built through access to capital. A person who could secure a loan could buy property, open a business, hire workers, and create something that benefited future generations. Without that access, even the hardest work could struggle to become lasting wealth. That was why Freedom National Bank mattered. It existed because Harlem needed more than a place to store money. It needed an institution that understood the community it served. The bank's rise was part of a much larger movement. Across America, Black entrepreneurs, civil rights leaders, and community organizers understood that political rights and economic power had to move together. Jackie Robinson understood this better than most. Many people remember him for the historic moment when he stepped onto a baseball field and broke Major League Baseball's color barrier. But his work after baseball revealed another side of his legacy. He was not only fighting for representation, he was fighting for opportunity. Robinson believed that the next generation needed more than inspiration. They needed access to the systems that allowed people to build wealth. A young person could dream of owning a business, buying a home, or creating something meaningful. But without financial institutions willing to support those dreams, progress would always be limited. Freedom National Bank represented that possibility. Although the bank eventually failed, the need that created it never disappeared. Across the country, many communities continued facing challenges related to access to capital, business financing, and economic opportunity. The story of Freedom National Bank also revealed an important lesson about building institutions. A powerful mission can bring people together, a respected leader can inspire confidence, a community can create something extraordinary. But for that institution to survive, it must also adapt, manage risk, and compete in a constantly changing environment. That was the challenge faced by many Black-owned banks throughout American history. They were often created with fewer resources while serving communities that needed them the most. They carried the responsibility of being both financial institutions and symbols of progress. Freedom National Bank carried that responsibility for years. At its peak, it showed what was possible when a community believed in itself. It proved that Black-owned financial institutions could grow, serve thousands of customers, and become major forces in American business. Its collapse was painful, but its existence was historic. Because before the bank closed, it had already achieved something important. It changed the way people thought about economic power. It showed that wealth was not only created by large corporations or established financial giants. It could also be built by communities that organized, invested, and believed in their own potential. Today, Jackie Robinson's name remains connected to courage and breaking barriers. But the story of Freedom National Bank reveals another part of his legacy. He understood that the fight for equality did not end when someone was allowed into a stadium, a workplace, or a public institution. The fight continued in boardrooms, banks, and businesses. Because true independence requires more than the freedom to participate. It requires the power to build. Freedom National Bank may have disappeared, but the dream behind it remains. A dream that communities should have the ability to control their own financial destiny. A dream that access to opportunity should not depend on someone's race. And a dream that the wealth created by a community should have the chance to strengthen that same community. That was the vision Jackie Robinson supported. And that is why, decades after its collapse, the story of Freedom National Bank is still worth remembering. Freedom National Bank may be gone, but its story remains a powerful reminder of what happens when a community fights to control its own future. If you enjoyed this journey through one of the untold chapters of Black economic history, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Black Status, and turn on notifications for more stories about the businesses, leaders, and empires that shaped history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.